Hey folks, I'm excited to share some stories with you today that I've written myself. Whether you're a long-time follower or just joining us, I'd love to hear your thoughts on these tales. Don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe if you're new here. Let's dive in, and I hope you enjoy. I'm a dark web Michelin chef. Today's course is humans. I never thought I'd end up here, but here I am, cooking humans. Yeah, you read that right. I've been a chef for over 20 years, worked in some of the finest restaurants around the world. I earned my Michelin stars the hard way, but the world of high cuisine isn't always what it seems. Behind the polished kitchens and pristine white tablecloths, there's a dark underbelly. It all started when I got a mysterious invitation. It was a regular day at the restaurant, prepping for the dinner service, when I received an email. The subject line read, "An offer you can't refuse." Usually, I delete spam without a second glance, but something about this one caught my eye. Maybe it was the curiosity or the promise of an opportunity, but I opened it. The email was brief and to the point. It mentioned a new, exclusive culinary club that catered to the most elite and discerning palates. They wanted me to join their ranks and offered a sum of money that was too good to be true. They promised secrecy and discretion, stating that their members valued privacy above all else. At the bottom of the email was a link to a dark website. I'd heard of the dark web, of course, but I'd never had any reason to venture into it. My hands were already shaking as I copied the link into my Tor browser. The page that loaded was minimalistic. Black background, white text, and a single button. Enter. I clicked it, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. The next page asked for a password, which was conveniently provided in the email. I typed it in, and the screen filled with an elaborate contract. It was a non-disclosure agreement, promising dire consequences if any of the club's activities were leaked. It seemed over the top, but I was intrigued. I signed the digital document and clicked submit. A chat window popped up immediately. "Welcome, chef. We've been expecting you." The messages came in real time from someone who called themselves the director. They were friendly enough, explaining that this club was indeed for the culinary elite, but with a twist. They catered to tastes that the regular world deemed unacceptable. I was hooked, the adrenaline coursing through my veins. They told me about the first event, a gathering to be held in an undisclosed location. My instructions were to prepare a meal for the club's members using a very specific ingredient. When I asked what that ingredient was, the director's reply sent chills down my spine. Human flesh. I wanted to close the browser, forget the whole thing, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the money, maybe it was the challenge, or maybe it was the curiosity to see how far the rabbit hole went. Whatever it was, I found myself typing back, "I'm in." The director was pleased. They provided detailed instructions on how to obtain the ingredient and where to meet the supplier. The rendezvous was set for the following night in a secluded part of the town. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with the possibilities and the horror of what I was about to do. The next evening, I found myself driving to the location. It was an old, abandoned warehouse, the kind you see in crime dramas. My heart pounded as I parked the car and stepped out. The place was eerily quiet, the only sound being my footsteps echoing. In the empty space, I approached the door, which creaked open with an ominous groan. Inside, it was dark, save for a single dimly lit room at the far end. I walked towards it, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the room, I was greeted by a man in a suit, his face obscured by shadows. "Are you the chef?" he asked in a low, gravelly voice. I nodded, unable to speak. He gestured for me to follow him, leading me to a large refrigerated container. With a swift motion, he unlocked it and opened the doors. Inside were several bodies, neatly arranged as if they were mere cuts of meat in a butcher shop. I felt my stomach churn, but I kept my composure. The man handed me a large insulated bag and nodded towards the bodies. "Take your pick," he said. I moved closer, the cold air from the container making my skin prickle. The bodies were all young, probably in their 20s or 30s. They looked peaceful, almost as if they were sleeping. I selected a young man, his skin pale and flawless. The man in the suit helped me load the body into the bag, and with that, my task was done. Driving back to my restaurant, I couldn't shake the image of the bodies from my mind. I kept telling myself it was just meat, just another ingredient. But deep down, I knew it was so much more than that. It was a line I was about to cross, a line I could never come back from. Back in my kitchen, I laid the body out on the stainless steel table. It felt surreal, like a scene from a horror movie. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my hands as I began the process. I treated it like any other meat, carefully slicing and preparing the cuts. The flesh was surprisingly tender, the marbling perfect. As I worked, a strange sense of calm washed over me. It was as if the act of butchering a human being was therapeutic, a dark and twisted meditation. I found myself focusing on the task at hand, the precision of each cut, the artistry of the preparation. By the time I was done, I had several cuts of meat ready for cooking. The next step was to prepare the dishes. I decided on a multi-course meal, each one showcasing the unique flavors and textures of the human flesh. For the appetizer, I made a delicate tartare, seasoned with fresh herbs and a hint of citrus. The main course was a succulent roast, served with a rich red wine reduction. Dessert was a sweet and savory combination, using the fatty parts to create a creamy custard. As the night wore on, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of pride. The dishes looked and smelled incredible, the culmination of years of training and experience. I plated each course with the same care and attention I would any other meal, the presentation flawless. When the time came to deliver the meal, I packed everything carefully and made my way to the designated meeting point. The director was there, waiting with a group of masked individuals. They inspected the dishes, nodding in approval as they sampled each one. "You've outdone yourself, chef," the director said, his voice filled with satisfaction. "Our members will be very pleased." I watched as they loaded the meal into a waiting vehicle, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. I had done it. I had cooked human flesh and delivered a meal that would be talked about in the darkest corners of the culinary world. Driving home that night, I couldn't help but wonder what I had become. A chef? A butcher? A monster? The lines were blurred, and I wasn't sure I cared anymore. The thrill of the forbidden, the allure of the dark web, had taken hold of me. After the initial shock of my first human cooking experience, life went back to a semblance of normalcy, at least on the surface. I continued to run my restaurant, serving high-end dishes to oblivious patrons who had no idea what I was really capable of. But the thrill of that night, the adrenaline rush, stayed with me. I found myself eagerly awaiting the next email from the director. It didn't take long for the next invitation to arrive. This time, It was for a private dinner party, an exclusive event for the club's highest-ranking members. The location was an opulent mansion in the countryside, far from prying eyes. The director's message was clear. They wanted something spectacular, a feast that would surpass all expectations. I spent the next few days planning the menu. The pressure was immense, but I thrived on it. Each course had to be perfect, each flavor combination meticulously balanced. The centerpiece of the meal would be a whole roasted human, a culinary masterpiece that would push the boundaries of taste and morality. The procurement process was smoother this time. I met the same man in the suit at a different location, another abandoned building on the outskirts of town. The bodies were fresher, their skin still warm to the touch. I selected a young woman, her body lean and athletic, and transported her back to my kitchen with a grim sense of purpose. Back at the restaurant, I began the preparation. I treated the body with the same care and respect I would any high-quality ingredient. The butchering process was almost ritualistic, each cut precise and deliberate. I marinated the meat in a blend of exotic spices and herbs, allowing the flavors to penetrate deep into the flesh. The day of the feast arrived, and I loaded the prepared dishes into my van. The drive to the mansion was long, the winding roads taking me further into the remote countryside. The mansion itself was breathtaking, a sprawling estate surrounded by lush gardens and high walls. Security was tight, with guards stationed at every entrance. Inside, the atmosphere was one of decadent luxury. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the elegantly dressed guests. The dining room was set up with a long, polished table, adorned with fine china and silverware. The guests, all masked to maintain anonymity, mingled and chatted in hushed tones. I set up in the kitchen, a state-of-the-art space that put my restaurant's kitchen to shame. As I began plating the first course, a shiver of anticipation ran down my spine. This was my moment to shine, to prove myself to the elite of the dark web culinary world. The first course was a delicate carpaccio, thin slices of raw human flesh drizzled with a truffle oil vinaigrette. The guests savored each bite, their masked faces betraying nothing but the occasional appreciative nod. The second course was a rich and hearty stew. The tender meat simmered in a broth of rare spices and vegetables. As the courses progressed, the atmosphere in the dining room grew more intense. The guests at Taco were clearly impressed, their murmurs of approval growing louder with each dish. The main course, the whole roasted human, was the pièce de résistance. I had carefully seasoned and basted the body, ensuring that the skin was crispy and golden, the meat succulent and juicy. The guests watched in awe as I carved the roast, serving each portion with a flourish. The flavors were unlike anything they had ever tasted, a symphony of savory and sweet, rich and complex. The room was filled with the sounds of pleasure and satisfaction, the guests lost in the ecstasy of the meal. As I served the final course, a decadent dessert made from the fat and organs, I couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. I had succeeded in creating a meal that transcended the boundaries of conventional cuisine, a feast that would be remembered for years to come. The director approached me as the guests lingered over their drinks and cigars. "You've exceeded our expectations, chef," he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "Our members are most pleased. You've secured your place in the club." I nodded, my heart swelling with pride, but as I looked around the room, At the masked faces and the empty plates, a dark realization settled over me. I had crossed a line, one that I could never uncross. The thrill of the forbidden, the lure of the dark web had changed me. I was no longer just a chef. I was a purveyor of the macabre, a creator of culinary horrors. Driving home that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The money, the prestige, the thrill, it all came at a price. I had sold my soul to the dark web, and there was no turning back. The feast was over, but the hunger for more lingered, a gnawing emptiness that could never be sated. And I knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning. Life after the feast was a strange mix of normalcy and paranoia. By day, I ran my restaurant as usual, serving gourmet dishes to unsuspecting patrons. By night, I couldn't escape the memories of what I'd done. The thrill, the horror, the taste, it all haunted me. Then came the new demands. The director contacted me again, this time with a more urgent and specific request. The club's members were eager for another gathering, and they wanted something more exotic, more elaborate. The next meal had to include not just human flesh, but also a variety of unique human-based ingredients. The idea was sickening, yet fascinating. The director provided a list of body parts and organs, each with detailed instructions on how they wanted them prepared. It was a challenge unlike any I'd faced before, and I knew it would push my skills to the limit. The procurement was even more complicated this time. They needed specific types of people, young, healthy, with certain physical attributes. It was no longer just about getting a body. It was about getting the right body. The man in the suit, my supplier, became more involved, providing detailed profiles and ensuring the bodies met the club's exacting standards. One night, I received a text from the supplier. Pick up at midnight. Be ready. The location was a run-down motel on the edge of town. I arrived early, the desolate parking lot sending shivers down my spine. The supplier was already there, standing beside a nondescript van. "This one's special," he said, opening the van doors. Inside was a young man, barely 20, his body flawless and untouched. "The club wants a full breakdown, every part used." I nodded, feeling a mix of revulsion and curiosity. We loaded the body into my van and I drove back to the restaurant, the weight of my task pressing down on me. This wasn't just cooking. This was something far darker. In the kitchen, I laid the body out and began the meticulous process of butchering. The cuts had to be perfect, each piece destined for a specific dish. The organs were harvested carefully, each one reserved for a particular course. The heart, liver, kidneys, and even the brain, all were to be used in the meal. The preparation was grueling, both physically and mentally. I worked through the night, my hands moving with practiced precision despite the horror of what I was doing. Each dish required a different technique, a different set of skills. The heart was seared and served rare, its rich meaty flavor complemented by a tangy reduction. The liver was turned into a smooth pat, spread on delicate crostini. The kidneys were braised in a fragrant sauce, their earthy taste balanced by fresh herbs. The brain was the most challenging. I decided to make a creamy mousse, blending it with rich cream and subtle spices. It was a risky dish, one that could easily go wrong, but I relished the challenge. The final touch was a garnish of candied blood, adding a sweet and macabre element to the presentation. When the meal was finally ready, I felt a strange sense of accomplishment. It was grotesque, but it was also a testament to my skills as a chef. I had taken the most horrifying of ingredients and turned them into something exquisite. The dinner was held in another lavish mansion, this one even more secluded than the last. The security was tighter, the atmosphere more intense. The guests were already seated when I arrived, their anticipation palpable. The director greeted me with a nod, his eyes gleaming with approval. As I served the first course, the room fell silent. The guests tasted the dishes, their reactions hidden behind their masks. But the murmurs of approval, the satisfied sighs, told me everything I needed to know. They were pleased, more than pleased. They were enraptured. The meal progressed, each course more daring and elaborate than the last. The heart, the liver, the kidneys, all were met with acclaim. But it was the brain mousse that truly captivated them. The delicate texture, the rich flavor, the unexpected sweetness of the candied blood. It was a triumph. By the end of the meal, the guests were in a state of euphoric satisfaction. The director approached me, his demeanor one of barely concealed glee. "You've outdone yourself again, chef," he said, handing me a thick envelope. "The members are beyond impressed. You've secured your place as our top chef." I accepted the envelope, my hands trembling slightly. The money was substantial, more than I had ever made from a single event. But it wasn't just about the money. It was about the power, the thrill, the dark satisfaction of knowing I had created something truly unique. Driving home, I felt a strange mix of emotions: pride, disgust, excitement, fear. I was in too deep now, too far gone to turn back. The dark web had its hooks in me, and there was no escaping it. The demands would continue, the challenges would grow more extreme, but I was ready. I had embraced the darkness, and there was no turning back. The chef had become the butcher, the artist had become the monster, and the feast had only just begun. After the success of the second feast, I thought I would be prepared for anything, but the Dark Web Culinary Club had a way of constantly pushing boundaries, and soon I found myself spiraling deeper into a world of obsession and depravity. The line between my professional life and my secret life grew increasingly blurred, and the demands from the director became more frequent and more elaborate. It started with a phone call late one night. The director's voice was as calm and composed as ever, but there was an urgency in his words. "We have a special event coming up, chef. A celebration for one of our most esteemed members. We need something extraordinary." The brief was clear: a multi-sensory dining experience that would not only satisfy, but utterly captivate the senses of the guests. The director hinted at using not just human flesh, but also incorporating elements of psychological and emotional stimulation. It wasn't just about taste anymore. It was about creating an immersive, unforgettable experience. I spent days planning, researching, and experimenting. The idea of using fear and adrenaline as ingredients intrigued me. I wanted to see how these emotions could be harnessed to enhance the flavors and overall dining experience. The process was both thrilling and deeply unsettling. The first step was to select the ingredients. This time, it wasn't just about physical attributes. The director provided detailed profiles focusing on individuals who had experienced intense fear and trauma. The logic was that their flesh, infused with high levels of adrenaline, would offer a unique taste profile. It was twisted, but I was too far gone to question it. The procurement was handled discreetly. The supplier delivered 2 bodies, both young women who had recently been through harrowing experiences. Their bodies still bore the marks of their final moments, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. I felt a pang of guilt, but it was quickly overshadowed by the thrill of the challenge. In the kitchen, I began the meticulous process of preparing the bodies. Each cut, each slice, was done with precision and care. The flesh was marinated in a mixture of rare herbs and spices designed to complement and enhance the natural flavors. I experimented with various techniques, from slow cooking to flash searing, to find the perfect balance of texture and taste. The most challenging part was incorporating the psychological elements. I decided to create a dining environment that would evoke a sense of unease and fear, heightening the guest's sensory perception. The dining room was transformed into a dimly lit, eerie space, with unsettling soundscapes playing in the background. The table was set with dark, Gothic-themed decor, creating an atmosphere of macabre elegance. The first course was a delicate consommé, made from the bones and marrow, infused with herbs known for their calming properties. The idea was to lull the guests into a false sense of security before the main courses. As they sipped the broth, the room grew progressively darker, the sounds more haunting. The second course was a tartare, the raw flesh seasoned with exotic spices and served with a side of fear-inducing visuals projected on the walls. The guests ate in silence, their senses heightened by the unsettling environment. The flavors were intense, the adrenaline-infused flesh offering a unique, almost electric taste. For the main course, I prepared a series of small, intricate dishes, each one designed to evoke different emotions. There was a seared heart, its rich, meaty flavor contrasted by the bitterness of dark chocolate. A liver pâté, smooth and creamy, served with a tangy, blood-red reduction. And the pièce de résistance, a brain mousse, light and airy, with a subtle sweetness that lingered on the palate. As the meal progressed, the guests became more engrossed in the experience. Their masks couldn't hide the looks of fascination and horror on their faces. The combination of flavors, textures, and the disturbing ambience created a dining experience unlike any other. It was exactly what the director had wanted. A meal that was not just eaten, but felt deeply and viscerally. The final course was a dessert that combined elements of pleasure and pain. A rich custard made from the fatty tissues, topped with a caramelized sugar crust that crackled with every bite. Each mouthful was a sensory overload, the sweet and savory notes mingling with the lingering fear in the room. When the meal ended, the guests sat in stunned silence. The director stood, applauding slowly, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "Once again, chef, you have outdone yourself. This was a true masterpiece." I nodded, my hands trembling with a mix of exhaustion and adrenaline. The envelope he handed me was thicker than ever, but it felt heavier too, burdened with the weight of what I had done. The guests left one by one, their expressions hidden behind their masks, but their lingering gazes told me everything. They were captivated, horrified, and deeply satisfied. Driving home, I couldn't escape the images of the night, the faces of the victims, the taste of their flesh, the looks of awe and terror on the guests' faces. I had created something extraordinary, but at what cost? The line between my art and my humanity was fading, and I wasn't sure I could find my way back. The obsession was consuming me, driving me to new heights of culinary depravity. The dark web had become my world, its demands and challenges my new normal. I was no longer just a chef. I was a creator of nightmares, a master of macabre cuisine, and I knew, deep down, that the darkness would only grow. The demands would become more extreme, the challenges more perverse. But I was ready. The chef had become the monster, and the feast was far from over. The days after the last event passed in a blur. My restaurant continued to thrive, but my mind was elsewhere. The dark web culinary club had become my obsession, my addiction. Each new challenge they presented pushed me further into a twisted world where the boundaries of morality and decency no longer existed. I had become a maestro of the macabre, a chef who could turn horror into haute cuisine. The director's next request came sooner than expected. This time, it wasn't just a meal. It was an experience, a multi-course event that would be live-streamed to the club's most elite members around the world. They wanted to witness the entire process, from procurement to preparation to plating. It was a spectacle of horror, a show that would cement my place as the dark web's most infamous chef. The preparation began weeks in advance. The director provided a list of specific individuals they wanted for the meal. Each had a unique characteristic: a marathon runner for their lean muscle, a pianist for their delicate fingers, a dancer for their toned legs. The selection process was meticulous, each profile scrutinized for the perfect ingredients. The supplier outdid himself, delivering the bodies in pristine condition. I received them one by one, each arrival shrouded in secrecy and darkness. My kitchen became a place of unending horror, the stainless steel stained with the evidence of my monstrous work. The bodies were stored in a walk-in freezer, their cold, lifeless forms waiting for the final event. The live stream was set to take place in a specially prepared location, an abandoned theater, its stage transformed into a nightmarish kitchen. Cameras were set up to capture every detail, every cut, every gruesome step of the process. The director oversaw the preparations, ensuring that everything was perfect for the club's discerning audience. The night of the event arrived, and I stood on the stage, the bright lights casting harsh shadows on the walls. The theater was empty, save for the cameras and the director, who watched from the wings. The first body was brought out, laid on a stainless steel table in the center of the stage. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every detail as I began the butchering process. The audience watched in silence as I worked, their reactions hidden behind the anonymity of the dark web. Each cut was precise, each slice methodical. The flesh was marinated, the organs harvested, the bones simmered for stock. It was a gruesome ballet, a dance of death and culinary expertise. The first course was a tartare, the raw flesh seasoned with exotic spices and served with a side of fear. The cameras captured the glistening meat, the delicate presentation. The comments from the live chat scrolled across the screen, a mix of awe and horror. The second course was a consommé. The rich broth simmered from the bones and marrow. The flavor was intense, the essence of the victim distilled into a single, powerful taste. The audience was captivated, their fascination palpable, even through the screen. The main course was a series of intricate dishes, each one showcasing a different part of the body. The heart was seared and served with a blood-red reduction. The liver was transformed into a smooth pâte, spread on delicate crostini. The brain was made into a mousse, its creamy texture paired with a tangy, candied blood garnish. Each dish was a testament to my skill, my ability to turn the grotesque into gourmet. As the meal progressed, the atmosphere grew more intense. The comments from the live chat became more frenzied, the viewers caught up in the macabre spectacle. The final course was a dessert that combined elements of pleasure and pain. A rich custard made from the fatty tissues, topped with a caramelized sugar crust. The sweetness was balanced by a hint of bitterness, a reminder of the horror behind the meal. When the last dish was served, I stepped back, the adrenaline coursing through my veins. The director approached, his face lit by the glow of the screens. "You've done it, chef," he said, his voice filled with pride. "You've created something truly unforgettable." I nodded, my mind racing with a mix of triumph and terror. The live stream ended, the viewers logging off one by one, their hunger for the grotesque temporarily sated. The theater fell silent, the cameras turned off, the lights dimmed. Driving home that night, I felt a strange emptiness. The thrill was gone, replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. I had crossed every line, broken every taboo, and yet it wasn't enough. The darkness had consumed me, and there was no escape. The next day, I received a package from the director. Inside was a black envelope, thick and heavy. I opened it to find a single sheet of paper, the words written in elegant script. "Welcome to the abyss. Your journey has only just begun." I stared at the words, the realization sinking in. There would always be more demands, more challenges, more horrors to create. The dark web had become my life, its shadow stretching over every aspect of my existence. I was no longer just a chef. I was a servant of the darkness, bound by my own obsession. And so I continued, driven by a hunger that could never be satisfied. The chef had become the monster, the artist of the macabre. And the abyss, the endless, terrifying abyss, was now my home. I found a job on the dark web. I am a deep ocean explorer for the second biggest and secret NASA company no one knows about. The government doesn't want you to know about my latest discovery. Alright, so I'm posting this here because I have no idea where else to go. I've been lurking on this sub for a while, and after what happened, I think you guys are the only ones who might believe me. So, I've been out of work for a few months, got laid off from my job at the shipping dock, and bills were piling up. I was desperate. One night, after a few too many beers, I found myself diving into the depths of the dark web. Don't ask me how I got there, I just did. And that's when I saw it. A job listing. It was titled, "Deep Ocean Explorer Needed." The description was vague but enticing. Looking for a brave soul to explore the deepest parts of the ocean. Must be willing to relocate and work in extreme conditions. High pay. There was no company name, just an email address. I don't know what possessed me. Maybe it was the alcohol or my desperation, but I sent an email. Within hours, I got a response. They wanted to meet. The next day, I found myself in a rundown warehouse on the outskirts of town. It looked like something out of a horror movie. Rusty metal doors, broken windows, the whole 9 yards. I almost turned around, but something inside me pushed me forward. Inside, I was greeted by a man in a lab coat. He looked normal enough, but there was something off about him. His eyes were too cold, too calculating. He introduced himself as Dr. Evans and got straight to the point. "We've been watching you, and we think you're perfect for this job. It's dangerous, but the pay is substantial. Are you interested?" I nodded. What else could I do? He handed me a contract, and without even reading it, I signed. That night, They put me on a private jet to a remote island in the middle of nowhere. The place was crawling with security, and the whole thing felt super secretive. I was taken to an underground facility that looked like something out of a sci-fi movie. Massive tanks filled with strange creatures, high-tech equipment, the works. Dr. Evans gave me a tour and explained that this was a joint venture between NASA and a private company that no one knew about. Their goal was to explore the deepest parts of the ocean, places no human had ever been before, and they wanted me to be their next explorer. I should have been thrilled, but something felt wrong. The way the scientists looked at me, like I was a lab rat, the eerie silence in the hallways, the way doors would slam shut and lock behind me. But I needed the money, so I kept my mouth shut. They trained me for weeks, teaching me how to use their equipment, how to survive in extreme conditions. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, not just by the cameras, but by something else. Something in the water. The day of the first dive came. They fitted me with a high-tech diving suit and strapped me into a submersible. Dr. Evans was there, smiling that cold smile of his. "Good luck," he said as they lowered me into the water. As I descended into the darkness, the weight of the ocean pressing down on me, I started to feel a sense of dread. The water grew colder and the light from the surface faded away. I was completely alone, surrounded by nothing but black water. Hours passed, or maybe it was days. Time had no meaning down there. I started to see things, shapes moving in the darkness, eyes watching me. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but then I saw it. A massive creature, unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was like a giant squid, but twisted and malformed. Its tentacles writhed, and it had too many eyes, all of them staring right at me. I tried to radio back to the surface, but my comms were dead. The creature came closer, and I saw that it wasn't alone. There were more of them, all different, all horrifying. They surrounded my submersible, tapping on the glass with their tentacles. I could hear their voices in my head, whispering things I couldn't understand, but felt in my bones. I was trapped. I tried to ascend, but the controls were unresponsive. The creatures tightened their grip, pulling me deeper. I don't know how long I was down there, but eventually they let go. I floated in the darkness, my mind shattered. When they finally pulled me back to the surface, I was barely conscious. Dr. Evans was there, smiling that same cold smile. "Welcome back," he said. They took me to a debriefing room and asked me what I saw. I told them everything, and they just nodded, like it was exactly what they expected. Then they told me to rest and prepare for the next dive. I can't do it. I can't go back down there. I need to get out, but I don't know how. They're watching me, always watching. If anyone reads this, please help me. I don't know how much time I have left. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those creatures, heard their whispers. I knew I couldn't stay there, but I was trapped. The island was surrounded by armed guards, and I had no idea how to escape. The next morning, Dr. Evans called me to his office. The room was sterile, clinical, with strange diagrams and charts plastered on the walls. He greeted me with that same cold smile and gestured for me to sit. "We need to debrief," he said, sliding a thick file across the table. "We recorded everything from your dive. We know what you saw. We just need to understand it." I opened the file and saw photos of the creatures, detailed sketches and notes written in a language I couldn't decipher. My heart raced as I flipped through the pages. "What the hell are these things?" I asked. Dr. Evans leaned back in his chair. "We call them abyssals. They're a species we've been studying for years. We believe they possess a form of intelligence, possibly even a hive mind. Your dive confirmed our theories." I felt sick. "You knew they were down there? You sent me down there without telling me?" He shrugged. "It was necessary. We needed first-hand observation. You did well, but we need more data. You'll be going back down." "No," I said, standing up. "I'm not going back. You can't make me." He sighed and pressed a button on his desk. The door behind me opened, and 2 armed guards stepped in. "I'm afraid you don't have a choice," he said. "You signed a contract. You're property of this facility now." The guards grabbed me, and I fought, but it was no use. They dragged me back to my quarters and locked the door. I spent hours pacing, trying to come up with a plan. I knew I had to get out, but how? Later that night, I heard a faint tapping on my window. My room was underground, with a small reinforced glass window looking out into the ocean. I crept over and looked out. At first, I saw nothing but darkness. Then a shape emerged, pressing itself against the glass. It was one of the abyssals, smaller than the ones I'd seen before, but just as terrifying. Its tentacles tapped on the glass, and I heard its voice in my head, clearer this time. "Help us!" I stumbled back, my mind racing. They wanted my help? How could I help them? I spent the rest of the night in a daze, trying to make sense of it all. When morning came, the guards returned and escorted me to the submersible. Dr. Evans was there, smiling as always. "Ready for another dive?" he asked. I didn't answer. They strapped me into the submersible and lowered me into the water. As I descended, the same sense of dread washed over me. This time, I was determined to do something different. As I reached the depths, the abyssals appeared again, surrounding my submersible. The smaller one pressed itself against the glass, whispering in my mind, "Follow us." I hesitated, but what choice did I have? I disengaged the autopilot and took manual control, following the creature as it led me deeper into the abyss. The water grew colder, the pressure more intense. I could feel the submersible groaning under the strain. We reached a massive underwater cavern, illuminated by a strange bioluminescent glow. The abyssals led me inside, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were structures down there, massive and ancient, covered in strange symbols. It looked like a city, long abandoned, and in the center, a massive pulsating mass of tentacles and eyes. The hive mind, I realized, the source of their intelligence. The smaller abyssal pressed itself against the glass again. "Help us," it repeated. "Destroy it." I didn't understand, but I knew I had to try. I activated the submersible's robotic arms and aimed the drill at the mass. As I drilled into it, the hive mind thrashed, its tentacles flailing. The abyssals screeched, their voices filling my mind. The mass exploded in a burst of light and sound, and the abyssals scattered. I felt a sense of relief, but it was short-lived. The submersible systems began to fail, and I started to ascend, praying I would make it to the surface. When I emerged from the water, Dr. Evans was waiting. He didn't look pleased. "What did you do?" he demanded. I didn't answer. The guards dragged me out of the submersible and back to my quarters. As they locked the door behind me, I knew I had made a grave mistake. The abyssals were free. But so was something else, something much worse. That night, I heard the tapping on my window again. The smaller abyssal was there, but this time it wasn't alone. The others had followed, and they weren't whispering for help anymore. They were calling for something else. I realized then that I had unleashed something terrible, and there was no way out. I spent the next few days in a state of constant anxiety. The gods watched me more closely, and Dr. Evans seemed even more obsessed with the data from my dives. He called me to his office daily, asking detailed questions about what I had seen and heard. Each time I told him the same thing. The abyssals wanted help, and I tried to give it to them, but I knew it wasn't enough. The tapping on my window became more frequent, more insistent. The whispers in my mind grew louder, more urgent. They weren't asking for help anymore. They were demanding something I couldn't understand. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I waited until the guards made their rounds, then quietly slipped out of my quarters. I made my way through the dimly lit corridors, avoiding the cameras as best I could. I knew where I needed to go, the lab where they kept all the research on the abyssals. The door was locked, but I had swiped a key card from one of the scientists earlier that day. I slipped inside and closed the door behind me. The lab was dark, filled with shelves of specimens and rows of computer terminals. I sat down at one of the terminals and began searching through the files. What I found made my blood run cold. The abyssals weren't just intelligent, they were ancient. The researchers had discovered evidence of their existence, dating back millions of years. They had once ruled the oceans, a highly advanced civilization with a technology far beyond our own. But something had happened, something that had driven them to the depths where they had remained hidden until now. I found records of experiments, horrific things they had done to the abyssals. They had captured them, tortured them, tried to harness their power, and in doing so, they had awakened something far worse, a primordial force that the abyssals had once worshipped as a god. As I read, I felt a cold dread settle over me. The thing I had seen in the cavern, the hive mind, it wasn't the source of their intelligence. It was a prison, a containment for this ancient god, and I had set it free. I heard a noise behind me and turned to see Dr. Evans standing in the doorway. His face was a mask of fury. "You shouldn't be here," he said, stepping into the lab. "You lied to me," I said, standing up. "You knew what was down there, and you sent me anyway." He shook his head. "You don't understand. We were trying to contain it, to study it. You've ruined everything." I backed away, my mind racing. "I'm getting out of here," I said, "and I'm going to tell the world what you've done." He laughed, a cold, mirthless sound. "You think you can just walk away? You're in too deep now. You belong to us." The door behind him opened, and the guards entered. I knew I had to act fast. I grabbed a nearby chair and swung it at the terminal, smashing the screen. Sparks flew, and the room plunged into darkness. I used the chaos to slip past the guards and run down the corridor. I had no plan, no idea where I was going. I just knew I had to get out. I ran through the maze of hallways, my heart pounding in my chest. Behind me, I heard the guards shouting, their footsteps echoing in the distance. I burst into the main atrium and saw the entrance to the submersible bay. If I could just get there, maybe I could escape. I sprinted towards the door, but before I could reach it, a massive explosion rocked the facility. The ground shook, and the lights flickered, plunging the atrium into darkness. I heard a low, rumbling growl, and the air grew cold. I turned and saw them, the abyssals, pouring through the shattered walls. They moved with an eerie grace, their tentacles writhing, their eyes glowing with an unholy light. They didn't attack me. Instead, they moved past me, swarming the guards and scientists, tearing them apart with a terrifying ferocity. I watched in horror as they ripped through flesh and bone, their whispers filling my mind with a cacophony of screams. I knew I had to move. I stumbled towards the submersible bay, my mind numb with fear. As I reached the entrance, I saw Dr. Evans, his cold smile gone, replaced by a look of sheer terror. He was trying to escape, but the abyssals were closing in. For a moment, our eyes met. Then with a final desperate scream, he was pulled into the mass of writhing tentacles. I turned away and ran to the nearest submersible, climbing inside and sealing the hatch behind me. I activated the controls and the submersible descended into the water. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get as far away from that place as possible. As I sank into the darkness, I heard their whispers in my mind one last time. You cannot escape. We are everywhere. I don't know how long I drifted. Hours, days, it all blurred together. Eventually, the submersible systems failed, and I was left floating in the dark, alone. The only light came from the faint glow of the abyssals, watching me from the shadows. I knew then that there was no escape. They had let me go, but only to spread their message. They were coming, and there was nothing we could do to stop them. If you're reading this, know that it's too late. The abyssals are free, and their god is waking. The world as we know it is about to end, and there's nothing any of us can do. I'm sorry. I floated in that dark, silent void for what felt like an eternity. The submersible's power was gone, and I had no way of contacting the surface. My mind was a storm of fear and guilt. I had unleashed something terrible, and now there was no way to undo it. Then a faint light appeared in the distance. At first, I thought it was another hallucination, but as it grew brighter, I realized it was real. It was a deep-sea research vessel, probably looking for me. I banged on the submersible's hull, hoping they would see me. They did. I felt the submersible lurch as they attached a tow cable and began to haul me up. As I ascended, the whispers in my mind faded, replaced by the hum of the ship's engines. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. I knew I still had to find a way to stop what I had started. When they pulled me aboard, the crew looked at me like I was a ghost. I must have looked like one. I was pale, emaciated, and my eyes were wild with fear. They took me to the ship's infirmary, where I was given food, water, and a warm blanket. The ship's captain, a stern woman named Captain Ramirez, came to see me once I was stabilized. "What the hell happened down there?" she demanded. I told her everything about the abyssals, the secret facility, the ancient god. Her expression went from skeptical to horrified as I spoke. When I finished, she stood there for a moment, processing it all. "This is beyond anything I've ever heard," she finally said. "We need to get you to a secure location and inform the authorities." I shook my head. "No, the people running that facility are part of the government. They'll cover it up just like they did with everything else. We need to stop this ourselves." She looked at me like I was insane, but then she sighed. "All right, we have a research base a few miles from here. We'll head there and figure out our next move." The journey to the base was tense. The crew was on edge, constantly scanning the water for any signs of the abyssals. I spent most of the time in the infirmary, trying to piece together a plan. I knew that simply escaping wasn't enough. We had to find a way to destroy the abyssals and their god before they could reach the surface. When we arrived at the research base, it was eerily quiet. The crew disembarked and began securing the area, while Captain Ramirez and I headed to the command center. She pulled up all the data they had on the abyssals, and we started going through it. It was a long shot, but I had an idea. The only thing that had hurt the hive mind was the submersibles drill. If we could rig a larger version of it, maybe we could destroy the god before it fully awakened, but we would need a lot of power, and the only place that had enough was the main facility where this all started. It was a suicide mission, but there was no other choice. We spent the next few days preparing. The crew retrofitted one of the deep-sea drilling rigs with explosives and powerful sonar equipment. It was crude, but it was the best we could do with the limited resources we had. The night before we left, I had a nightmare. I was back in the abyss, surrounded by the abyssals. They weren't attacking me. They were just watching, waiting. Their whispers were clearer than ever. You cannot win. We are eternal. I woke up in a cold sweat, but I knew I couldn't back out now. We had one chance to stop them, and we had to take it. The journey back to the facility was tense. The crew was silent, each lost in their own thoughts. When we arrived, the place was in ruins. The abyssals had torn through the buildings, leaving nothing but rubble and twisted metal in their wake. We moved quickly, setting up the drilling rig and wiring the explosives. The plan was simple. We would drill into the god's prison, plant the explosives, and detonate them remotely. It was risky, but it was our only hope. As we descended into the water, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. The abyssals were watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. We reached the cavern, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The god was there, its tentacles writhing, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. We drilled into the mass, the rig vibrating with the effort. The abyssals swarmed around us, but they didn't attack. They just watched, their whispers growing louder and more frantic. Finally, we planted the explosives and started our ascent. As we rose, the abyssals began to close in, their eyes filled with fury. I knew we were running out of time. We reached the surface and detonated the explosives. The water shook with the force of the blast, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then a massive wave surged towards us, throwing the rig and the ship into chaos. I was thrown overboard, the cold water engulfing me. I struggled to the surface, gasping for air. The ship was in flames, and the crew was scattered, desperately trying to survive. In the distance, I saw the god rising from the water, its tentacles thrashing. The explosion hadn't killed it. It had only made it angry. I knew then that we were doomed. The abyssals were free, and their god was coming. There was nothing we could do to stop it. As I floated in the water, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. You cannot escape. We are everywhere. I closed my eyes and let the darkness take me. When I regained consciousness, I was lying on a makeshift raft, adrift in the middle of the ocean. The sky above was a sickly gray, and the water around me was eerily still. My body ached, and my mind was foggy, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to find a way to end this once and for all. I floated for what felt like hours, maybe even days, before I saw it, a small island on the horizon. Using the last of my strength. I paddled towards it. When I reached the shore, I collapsed, my body too weak to move. I awoke to the sound of voices. Blinking against the harsh sunlight, I saw a group of people gathered around me. They were survivors from the research base, including Captain Ramirez. She knelt beside me, her face etched with concern. "You're alive," she said, relief evident in her voice. "We thought we lost you." I struggled to sit up, wincing at the pain. "The God, the abyssals, they're still out there." She nodded, her expression grim. "We know. After the explosion, we managed to regroup here. We've been trying to come up with a plan, but it's hopeless. They're too powerful." I shook my head. "There has to be a way. We can't just give up." She looked at me, desperation in her eyes. "What can we do? We don't have the resources, the manpower. We're stranded here." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my thoughts. There might be one last thing we can try. When I was down there, I saw something. The abyssals were afraid of the light. If we can rig up a powerful enough light source, maybe we can drive them back, even destroy them. She considered this for a moment, then nodded. "It's a long shot, but it's all we've got. Let's do it." The survivors rallied together, scavenging the island for any materials we could use. We found an old lighthouse, long abandoned but still standing. With what little equipment we had left, we managed to repair the generator and rig up a makeshift beacon. As night fell, we gathered at the base of the lighthouse. The air was thick with tension, and the ocean was disturbingly calm. We knew this was our last chance. We turned on the beacon, and the light cut through the darkness, illuminating the water. For a moment, nothing happened. Then we saw them. The abyssals emerged from the depths, their twisted forms writhing in the beam of light. They shrieked, their voices a cacophony of pain and fury. The light was working. They recoiled, trying to escape the searing beam, but we knew it wasn't enough. We needed to lure the god into the light, to destroy it once and for all. Captain Ramirez and I took the lead, using a smaller boat to navigate closer to the spot where the god had risen. We had rigged the boat with the smaller portable lights, hoping to draw the god towards the beacon. As we approached, the water began to churn, and a low, ominous growl filled the air. The god was coming. Its massive form rose from the depths, its tentacles thrashing, its eyes glowing with rage. We turned on the portable lights, directing them at the god. It shrieked, its body convulsing under the intense beam. Slowly, we backed towards the island, leading the creature into the path of the lighthouse's beacon. The god followed, its rage palpable. When it was directly in the beam of the lighthouse, we turned the generator to full power. The light intensified, becoming a blinding white that cut through the night. The god screamed, a sound that pierced through our minds. Its body writhed, tentacles flailing as the light burned into it. The abyssal shrieked and scattered, unable to withstand the intense illumination. We watched in awe and horror as the god began to disintegrate, its form dissolving into the light. The water around it bubbled and frothed, a maelstrom of chaos as the ancient being was torn apart. Finally, with one last ear-piercing scream, the god was gone. The water stilled, and the night was silent. We had done it. We had destroyed the god and driven the abyssals back into the depths. Exhausted, we returned to the island, the survivors embracing each other in relief and disbelief. We had faced the unthinkable and survived. Captain Ramirez approached me, a weary smile on her face. "You did it," she said. We did it. I nodded, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. It's over, but we need to make sure the world knows what happened here. We can't let this be covered up. She agreed, and together we began to plan our return to civilization. We knew it wouldn't be easy, but we had hope. We had faced the darkness and won. As we prepared to leave the island, I couldn't help but feel a lingering unease. The abyssals were still out there, lurking in the depths, and the gods' whispers still echoed in my mind. But for now, we had survived, and that was enough. If you're reading this, know that we fought back against the darkness, and we won. But be vigilant. The ocean holds secrets beyond our understanding, and some things are better left undisturbed.